Hello there, welcome to Ukrainian Media Podcast. I'm Olena Solodovnikova, and it's a great pleasure for me to be joined by Simon Schlegel, Zentrum, Liberale, Modernity, Berlin. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Olena. Nice to have you.
Simon, what are your impressions of the Munich conference? Was it beneficial for the conclusion of the peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, or vice versa?
I think it's a watershed moment in European and geopolitics for an American vice president to basically tell their transatlantic partners, their European partners, to that they're on their own continent, that the American security shield that protected them since the end of the Second World War is now moving to the Asia Pacific region, and that European nations need to deal with Russia and the threat it poses to Ukraine and other countries in Europe, that they're basically alone with that. And it also comes on the back end of the announcement by Donald Trump himself that he had a phone call with Putin, and of the speech of Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, that there is no perspective, no realistic perspective, in his words, for a NATO membership for Ukraine, and a reconquering of the Ukrainian territory in the borders of 1991. That is quite the watershed moment, and a very big weekend for Ukraine that really leaves European powers reeling. They don't have good answers for this, and that they're not ready to take this role over that the Americans want them to take over. Although they shouldn't be this surprised, maybe they knew that this was coming, but they're quite scrambling at the moment how to respond to that, as illustrated by the quickly arranged meeting in Paris today.
Yeah.
So it's a very shocking moment, although it looks more shocking now than it should look, because Europe knew that this was coming at some point, and that they would have to take over more of the responsibility and more of the risk that is associated with the war in Ukraine. And they are the ones whose security is on the line. First of all, Ukraine is the country whose security is on the line, but right after that, it's the security of Europe. And we're clearly caught on the wrong foot and caught unprepared here.
But after the US Vice President DG Vance made a sensational speech in which he criticized Europe, should EU countries respond on it, except of the summit which Macron already called? And can United States really leave Europe to deal with the war in Ukraine alone, or it's a blackmail in Europe, or try to push Europe to do something more?
It's definitely a try to push Europe, to shock Europe into action. I don't think it should be called blackmail, because indeed it's something that America has been calling for a long time, and especially Trump already during his first administration has repeated this narrative all over, that Europe needs to pay more. Now, I think what is new is that it looks like there's a very short timeline for this. Basically, now or tomorrow, negotiations between Trump and Putin should start in Saudi Arabia, and that is basically where a new reality sets in, right? And the Europeans are not ready for this reality, nor will they be for another many years, because the defense sector in European countries and in America, they're very closely interlinked through NATO, through joint defense corporations. It's not that easy to just disentangle them. The American military presence in Europe is very big. America also is responsible for a big part of the NATO command structure, for the officers that command NATO forces. So it's not easy to just replace the American military footprint for Europeans by going to Paris and deciding that. Even if they decide, they will need many years. And I think the people in the Trump administration are aware of that, and that they uh, try to speed up European development and European extension of security investments but that they know that they cannot just pull out overnight, that it's going to be a process. They just want to speed up this process.
But does the United States consider Ukraine as full-fledged actor now that involved in the decision-making processes or not?
Well, they are now talking to Putin, and as it looks, they are talking to Putin over the head of
Yeah.
Zelensky and also over the head of the European Union. That really puts Ukraine in the place of a small country that is not really in charge or that is not given the agency to decide its own future. That is very problematic. It's very problematic signaling to Moscow because that's what Putin has been saying all along. It's not a real country. It's not a country that can be trusted with making any decisions about its own security and about its own future. And it also underlines this narrative about Europe, that Europe is a club of uh, endlessly debating countries that never gets their act together and that don't really need to be taken into consideration when we take very consequential decisions. That is, of course, very problematic, but it's also a little bit the fault of European nations because they knew that they would at one point be in this position where they need to have a coherent and a shared strategy towards Russia and towards the future of Ukraine. And they too long they've been too timid and too frightened to get their act together as it is. Now I think it's really it shows as clearly as never before, and it comes in very stark terms from these Trump administration people, especially from Keith Kellogg, who said that who's the special envoy to for Ukraine, who said that Europe is not going to have a seat on the table, that they will be listened to, but that what they tell the Americans can pay attention to or not. That is very problematic, and I think it's also not going to be sustainable because what the Americans and the Russians decide without the Ukrainians and the Europeans doesn't bear any validity for these countries, and it will not be law for those countries, or will not be something that they can build their future actions on, and therefore it's unlikely to me that this is the path to a sustainable resolution of the conflict.
Actually, why does Trump tend to adopt a tone of appeasement to his conversation with Putin? He proposes to bring Russia back to J7, J8. What is the feasibility that the sanctions against Russia will be lifted? And what benefit does Trump give to the United States since Russia is not in the best economic position right now?
I think Trump has several incentives to do that. I think it's very prestigious for him to actually be in one room with Putin and to show everybody, look, I can, I can talk directly, and I brought the parties to a table. It's an election promise that he made, and he thinks in very short terms. I think his main objective is to show that he can fulfill his election promises, and he then will not take responsibility if the peace deal doesn't hold. He's going to blame others, Ukraine and the Europeans probably. But the other thing why he might use this appeasement is to actually bring Putin to the table. And it's easier to do that if you give away your best cards already and you say we don't need to talk about NATO and we don't need to talk about the return of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Then it's easier for Putin to fly to Saudi Arabia and to sit in one room with Trump. I think in peace negotiations, the devil is always in the detail, and that is not Trump's realm, right? He's a big gestures guy. He's a populist, and I think that's also where probably negotiations are going to break down when it comes to wait, how do we do this if we change the border? Where is it going to be exactly? And how do we do this with providing security in the future to Ukraine? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to put boots on the ground? I think that's where the real nitty-gritty stuff starts. The Russians are probably well prepared for that moment when Trump runs into contradictions, and they will probably just ask for more in these circumstances. And that's where I see Trump's problem in this, right? He has given away too much, he has promised too much, and he now flies to Saudi Arabia trying to smoothen over a situation where the Russians are just feeling the invitation to ask for even more, right? They will, as soon as they're being given something, they will ask for more. They will be asking for the same concessions towards other countries. They will be asking for a much reduced role of NATO in Eastern Europe. They will be asking for permanent right to influence internal domestic Ukrainian decisions. They will ask for more territory eventually, right? So it's a very dangerous path to go down, and probably one that Trump doesn't really appreciate how dangerous it is. I don't think he has a grand strategy towards Russia, and giving away your best cards before negotiations even start, it's it makes it much easier to get your counterpart to the table, but it really makes it easy then to ask anything from them.
Uh, yes, you give us hope because probably you have seen the last cover of Der Spiegel when the table with Ukraine on the table between the Russian and the USA, and they try to eat it divided. It's like Hitler and Stalin. I don't know. It is on the remark. Well, uh, 10 years ago, the Minsk Agreements were signed, and was it a mistake for Ukraine or a good attempt to delay a full-scale invasion? What is your stance on?
I think the question then was not a full-scale invasion. The question was whether the Europeans and the Americans would need to give Kiev military aid so they could withstand the full occupation of Donbass, for example. And that was something that 10 years ago, Western countries feared very much, to be drawn into the conflict, as they have then in 2022 anyway. But the Minsk II agreement, it gave Ukraine a breather. It allowed Ukraine to reform. It allowed Ukraine to build an army that basically didn't exist in 2014, an army that pushed back Putin's invasion army in 2022 from the gates of Kiev and of Kharkiv, which is not a small feat, of course. So that's probably where the Minsk agreement did bring some breathing space for Ukraine, but it had very deep flaws. One of or the main flaw of the Minsk agreement was that Russia was both a mediator and a party to the war. But according to the text in Minsk, it wasn't a party to the war. It was a mediator only, and it didn't have any obligations. It pushed all the responsibility away to the separatist forces in Luhansk and in Donetsk, which of course were created by Moscow. So it was they planted the seed of failure with that schizophrenic role of being both a mediator and a party to the war. They also didn't decide well enough, or that the text wasn't clear enough which step of the agreement would have to be implemented. For example, the idea that the separatists would go and hold elections under Kiev laws when Kiev wasn't controlling these territories, and only after that Kiev would be given back military control of the border. That was also quite naive, and it was a consequence of the high time pressure at the time. The Russian troops were taking over Debaltseve, and there was high pressure on the airport of Donetsk. So it was a moment when the Europeans felt they needed to decide very quickly, and they decided for a poor quality agreement, which Russia put a lot of traps and a lot of poisonous pills into it. It was quite clear also that many of the provisions from the Minsk agreement would not find political majorities in Ukraine. And then the following summer, in the summer of 2015, when Ukraine tried to reform its constitution to give a special status to Donbass, this led to very harsh protest from veterans, from the military. All of this was quite clear from the beginning, but it was a decision that was made under very high pressure. Now the pressure is also high, but it's a very different kind of pressure. It's not we fear an escalation because this has already happened. It's not that the West cannot give Ukraine military aid; it has already done so. It's not that if the next town, if Pokrovsk falls or if Chasiv Yar falls, that's the end of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. It's now more about the bleeding out of Ukraine, that Ukraine is really struggling to muster enough forces to hold the Russians back. And the Russians, in the long run, have a material advantage, both in weapons and in soldiers. So the Russians can go on for a longer time than the Ukrainians. That's the real danger, but it also gives more time to the Ukrainian and the Western negotiators. They can push for a better, a more solid, and a more sustainable agreement that doesn't have these poisonous pills in it. Of course, what Putin is looking for is exactly that, right? That he can now get a breather, but one that will be impossible to implement for Ukraine, so that in a couple of years, when he feels ready again, he can start all over again. That's the real danger here, and that's what we still have the opportunity to avoid at the moment.
But what are the conditions for signing a peace agreement now? Because now United States is persuading Ukraine to make a deal, as assistance in war for the exchanging of rare earth minerals. But can such proposal be trusted? And the main question for me, like a Ukrainian, wouldn't this make Ukraine a non-sovereign or even colonial state of the USA?
Any protection that the Ukrainians can get, it will be quite thin, and probably the best guarantee for the future is the Ukrainian army itself. So what is, I think, for me, on top of what cannot be given away is the right of Ukraine to have a strong army and to have a well-armed army. That is a big army. It's big enough to always have the front lines covered, to have enough people in the rear that get training, and to have a strong defense sector that can also receive investment from the West, right? That should be an army that can receive Western military aid. The West should make sure that this aid is coming. It should be an army that has a very strong air cover, so it can train in big units within Ukraine. All of that Putin will ask to give away, right? If you look at the Istanbul draft from 2022, it was the main sticking points where the Ukrainians and the Russians couldn't get closer to each other was the size of the army. How many soldiers can the Ukrainians have? How many pieces of artillery, planes, ships, and so on? Putin will look to reduce this army as much as possible, so Ukraine remains a soft target. And he will try to prohibit Ukraine from entering any alliances. So I think where the real red lines lie now is the strength of the Ukrainian military and the amount of aid it can get, and also who should monitor this contact line or the front line or wherever the line is being drawn. Somebody needs to monitor this. The Europeans are now saying that, or at least the UK and France are not excluding that they would send their own soldiers there, but it's such a long front line that it needs a very big group of soldiers equipped with high tech and weapons and all of that. The Europeans cannot just provide from today or tomorrow. So it's going to be a lengthy process that will involve both direct talks between the United States and Russia, but also should involve direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, because that's where the sustainable peace is going to come from. Is a regulation of the conflict in such a way that that allows Ukraine to keep on taking sovereign decisions and receiving military aid from wherever it feels it should get military aid. So we're really far away from securing that, but I think that should be the red line, and that should be sort of the compass of negotiation should be that Ukrainians take the final decision and the Ukrainians have the last word.
Yes, but now we have a choice to give all our minerals or not have a weapon. and then we will not have good economic situation because we will be under the protection every time of the USA in this situation.
Yeah, it's a very tight spot Ukraine is in, unfortunately, and I think doesn't quite agree yet with the
Yeah.
proposal that Trump made, or with the uh, how should you call that? With the proposal that Trump made, he might be able to negotiate a better position there. Because to access these minerals, of course, you need to have security. You need to be able to receive investments, and that is where he has some leverage to tell Trump. But if you really want to exploit these minerals, then we need to secure this area first, right? And for that, we need military aid. So I think this is not, you can just not just give away the rare earths for nothing or for things that Ukraine has already received. I think that's clear even to Trump. But you're right; it's a very, very tight spot, and Putin and Trump, they're both feeling, they both sort of have sensed the tough spot Ukraine is in, and they're trying to exploit it, which is really sad.
Yeah, and what do you think? What is the role of foreign peacemakers on these processes? Now we talk about the Brazilian and Chinese peacemaker on the border of Ukraine. Is it only symbolic gesture or not?
One problem is that Europe quite simply doesn't have that many soldiers to equip such a border with, or to send enough people there. Uh, so there are scenarios now wildly, just it's brainstorming. I think nobody has actually counted the soldiers in Brazil and India and China, and discussed what it would mean and who would pay for it and who would command them and what would be the rules to which they stick, and should they have a UN mandate or a mandate from a different organization. So all of this it's a blank sheet of paper. It needs to be uh, invented first, which is it brings some benefits. You can invent the rules and the structure of such a force in such a way that it really brings security and perhaps one day peace to Ukraine. But it also, of course, introduces a lot of uncertainties because Russia will want, if it ever allows foreign soldiers on Ukrainian territory, it will want to make them as well manipulatable as possible. So they will try to introduce structures and veto rights and what have you to try to be able to steer this force, or at least to be very close to steering it from Moscow, and that's probably problematic, especially if the Europeans are being asked to pay for it. Because if the Europeans don't have enough soldiers, they might find they have enough money to pay for other countries' soldiers to bring them there. But all of that at the moment is just really speculation. I haven't heard, any Brazilian politicians saying our troops are ready to be sent to Ukraine. It's a risky business as well because these troops are then in the reach of Russian missiles, and nobody has given an answer of what would happen if a group of Western soldiers would be killed or injured by a Russian rocket, right? And what would the American role be then? What is the backup from Washington? Would this lead to Article 5? Pete Hegseth in his speech has quite explicitly ruled that out. So it's basically sending foreign troops into Ukraine without much air cover, without much protection. That is something I think that also European politicians will have greatest trouble to explain to their voters. And even if you cross the ocean to Brazil or China, I think it's even further away there, and it's going to be very hard to explain to these people why they should send their own to protect Ukraine in a place that is always being quite far away to these countries, frankly, right? The narrative that Ukraine has tried to gain support with among countries in Africa and Latin America has always been that this is everybody's business, right? If the Russians are successful here, then the world order is falling apart. They have never believed that, right? They've never really bought into this, and they've always said like it's not our war, so why they should be sending
Yeah.
soldiers and risk their lives, it's really quite a distant prospect to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. But how do you accept the risk of Ukraine being divided among the European states? Because now notion is again being pushed by Russians that we need divide Ukraine between the European states. Why they do this now?
Yeah, I think that's fanciful. I don't think that I mean Russia would want to have its part of Ukraine that and then which they call Novorossiya or whatever they call it, and then they bring up all these other bits that did belong to other big empires in history to basically to float a narrative that the Ukraine is actually not a real country and should belong to their former imperialistic masters in Vienna and in Warsaw. That I think is just a little bit of fantasy to support the narrative that the Russians prefer that politics should be made in former imperial capitals. It should be made in Moscow and maybe in Washington, but that every part of Ukraine could belong to another country. I don't think that as long as the EU exists, the EU will just allow Poland or Hungary to take a bit of another country, and I think it's quite fanciful, and it's just a historical distortion to paint Ukraine as a country that would best be divided up.
Yes, but
I haven't heard any serious politicians in Warsaw or Budapest saying that this is what they're looking for.
yes, and the last statement of the Russian propagandist Dugin was that if Germans didn't vote for
AfD.
AfD, uh, Germany will be divided by and occupied by Russians. So ridiculous.
It's a threat. I mean, it's a clear threat to reinstall the European order of the 1950s. But I mean, it's also it leaves out a lot this idea by Dugin that Moscow should have one half of Europe and Washington the other. Is that it's Germany was divided into four zones, not just in two zones, right? The British and the French also got a zone, and they
Mhm.
ended up all being in NATO, and it was NATO that then basically gave the security protection to the western part of Germany. And he also leaves out that Germans reunited after Russia had no longer the military power to fight against civil society there, and I think it's quite comical that he uses this very clear example of a Russian defeat. The Eastern European nations, one after the other, decided they wanted to break free from Moscow's rule in the late 1980s. That he uses this uh, as an argument for people to vote for AfD. And it's also comical because AfD always says they're for free speech and for freedom of the Germans, and that Germans decide their own fate. And here you have a Russian threatening to vote for them or else. It's quite comical.
But do you think IFD supported by Russian money or not?
I think I'm not sure right now. I don't have the latest reporting on this, but if you go to German media, you can find a lot of stories how they have traveled to Russia, their MPs and their regional MPs, how they've traveled to Russia and how they have connections to Russia. But there is investigative journalism on this topic that you can find. I don't have the latest stories on this.
Okay, and my last question was about the considering possibility of the United States to take some territories of another country. Why did Trump mention these possibilities? Is it done for economic reasons or is it show of his power?
I'm not sure why Trump would do this. I think it's a populist move. Both the Panama project and the Greenland project. It's where he senses economic interests, and basically his narrative has always been if you're powerful enough, you can grab whatever you like. He probably still likes that idea that he could get away with this. He's been confirmed in getting away. His people have stormed the capital, and he's again in power. And these people who have stormed the capital, they are again free. So he's been taught that lesson that if you just are powerful enough, you can get away with that. And he probably therefore also got the idea that he's free to grab other countries' territory or infrastructure if he just backs it up with enough violence or power. Uh, I don't know. But why now? And what is his actual goal behind this rhetoric? I don't know. It's also so far it's basically rhetoric, and there's lots of people in Washington that realize that giving Ukrainian territory away without asking anything in return or allowing Russia to expand further would be against American interests. So it's not just this moment. We have a recency effect, but we also know that there are smart people in Washington, and maybe if Trump is not successful in getting everything that he wants and everything that he promises from Putin, he will change course. He's erratic. He's not an ideologist, right? He's guided by whatever is most suitable to him or useful to him on that day. So that can change with Putin's behavior as well. So it's a very sinister moment, but it's also something that is very unpredictable, and there's a lot of wiggling room in that. And it's the other good thing is that Europeans really, really feel the pressure now and have to get their act together.